Hi everyone, welcome to another Hatton's Model Railways live stream, and this morning we're looking at the mighty Britannia Pacific locomotives. Built in the early 1950s, they didn't quite have the lives that they certainly should have, but we can still enjoy two today out there in preservation and various different models available in different scales right now. So we'll be covering a bit of the history of these locomotives, giving you a bit of a reason why they were constructed, what duties they did in their traditional lives and in preservation too. And of course, we'll be getting a closer look at the models that you can pick up right now. If you can't wait to see those models, click the link in the description and you'll see every single model of a Britannia that we have either available right now or that you can pre-order on our pre-order system. If you've got any questions regarding these locomotives at all, please do ask them in the chat if you're watching today's stream live. If you're watching a little later on catch up, feel free to put your comments in the stream or get in touch with our customer experience team who would be more than happy to help you there too. So let's get started. Let's look at why these locomotives actually existed. And we've got to go right back to 1948. We just had the formation of the newly nationalised British railway system. This was the amalgamation of all four of the major operating companies and various other smaller companies being brought under direct government control under the new banner of British Railways. There's a lot of different locomotives coming in here, different designs, still used on their traditional networks, but BR wanted to construct a standardized locomotive fleet for the future. And they actually actioned a lot of locomotive exchanges, so trialed different locomotives on different parts of the network to see which of the big four railway companies had some of the best designs and the best features on their locomotives, with the intention of incorporating these into a brand new standardized set of locomotives. So a plan was drawn up, various different items were tested, and a requirement was seen for another Pacific locomotive with the 462 wheel arrangement that we see here. A lot of the styles and points on these locomotives have been incorporated from other locomotives. And as we can see here on the screen, this was the result of the design, the Britannia class that we see here, the original locomotive there being named Britannia. And the whole point of this locomotive was to increase the efficiency, but also lower the maintenance time and costs, so they could have a strong, powerful Pacific locomotive that really was easier to handle and incorporated all the new technology and features that had been discovered and developed in steam locomotives throughout the 1930s and 1940s. So we can see a lot of design from different companies here in our Britannia locomotive. The boiler and the trailing pony truck actually come from a very similar design to the Southern Region's Merchant Navy. And indeed, the axle loading and the rough weight of these locos was based on the light Pacifics. But then we can really see some LMS designs and features coming in there, some similar items such as the Ivet style high running plate to make everything a little bit easier to maintain. And you can really see the influence here of the main designer of this locomotive, E.S. Cox, who started with the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway, so was an LMS man through and through. And a lot of the standard locomotive designs really did haul back to the LMS designs immediately after World War II. So these locomotives were commissioned and constructed. They were constructed in 3 batches, with the first locos delivered in January 1951. That was number 70,000 here. A brand new numbering section for the standard locomotives started with this original item that you see here. And the batches then were built up until 1954. So the first 24 were provided in 1951. Numbers 70025 to 70044 were built from late 1952 to 1953. And the rest of these were then built in 1954. So a really successful design, certainly on paper anyway. A little bit of a lighter locomotive, but still really capable as a mixed traffic design. We can see that by the classification system on the side of the locomotive, suggesting 7MT for mixed traffic. So the 6'2" driving wheels on these locos allowed them to haul passenger trains at high speeds, but also gave them the right amount of grip and power to handle heavy freight services too. So a true heavy powered mixed traffic engine. So What's the problem? We've got a really good design here. We've got a locomotive that's pulled all the best features from some of the largest, most powerful locomotives of all of the big four rail companies. Surely this is a surefire winner. Surely the Britannia should go out there and completely take over. Unfortunately, as with a lot of things, there were some technical issues with these locomotives when they were first constructed. Some major issues actually saw the first 25 locomotives withdrawn in 1951, as they found some major issues with the wheels shifting on the axles, which could have caused quite a major incident. So they were withdrawn and very quickly amended, but that did a little bit to tarnish the reputation of these locomotives with certain crews. But they had started to spread around and replace some of the elderly locomotives across various different regions of the UK rail network. The first locomotives were introduced to the Great Eastern region from London Liverpool Street, working express trains to Norwich and Cambridge. And then a small fleet of the locomotives headed over to the Great Western region too, initially being based at Old Oak Common, Plymouth Lara, and at Cardiff Canton too. The only problem with this is these were left-hand drive locomotives. So all of the controls in these particular locos for the driver were on the left-hand side. The Great Western Railway had stuck pretty steadfastly to their right-hand drive locomotives. So quite a lot of the crews did dislike them, and they were actually declared surplus by the Great Western region in 1955. Some remained there, as the crews at Cardiff really did like them. But at the same time, it shows that a standard design doesn't really fit sometimes on railways that have been for independent railway companies for quite some time. But other places really did take fondly to these locomotives. A batch again appeared on the southern region from around 1953, replacing merchant navies for a time and then working alongside them. And you can see that the prestige these locomotives were treated with here, being assigned to one of the most important trains on the southern region of the network. This is the Golden Arrow boat train that ran in sections from London to Paris, with a boat in the middle crossing the channel before the Channel Tunnel came in there too. And whilst we've got one of the nameplates here on display, this is 70004, William Shakespeare, and the Britannia name comes from the naming policy for these locomotives. It was decided that all the engines needed to have a name that sounded pleasant and also something that was fully recognizable to even the most casual observer. So we have a few different styles on the Britannias, with them named after some famous British figures, including, as we've just said, William Shakespeare there, and of course Britannia herself. A lot of them were named after places where they worked too, and the Western region locomotives gained similar Western region names, such as Western Star. A batch built for the Scottish borders and working through Glasgow and Edinburgh were given local place names from the Scottish areas, such as Firth of Tay and Firth of Clyde were locomotives that worked up there. And a small number of them were named after territorial army divisions too. So a really good spread of names on these locomotives, with only one, 70047, never being named. All of the other 54 locomotives did carry names in service. So as you can see, although they were built as mixed traffic locomotives, their main purpose in the early 1950s was to work on express passenger duties and secondary passenger duties. There was also a fleet sent to Crewe, where they were constructed, where they worked on services along the North Wales coast to Holyhead and some of the other areas in the northwest there too. So coming up to the mid-1950s, some of the temporary technical issues have been ironed out, and they were really proving themselves as strong and capable locomotives. In this time, in the 4 years since the locomotives were first constructed and 1955, we'd seen many other standard design locomotives come onto the network, including other Pacifics, such as the Clan class, the 72,000s, and of course a selection of smaller tender and tank engines too. And this really was proving to be some quite successful designs with modern features for small and large locomotives. But all that was about to change. The Modernization plan in 1955 saw the wholesale requirement to remove steam from the network. The latest stage was to be around the 1980s, with some of the heavy 9F freight locomotives running in service until then. But Locomotives such as the Britannias were now pretty much obsolete, with the preference to bring in brand new technology with diesel and electric locomotives. Although they did remain on frontline duties for quite some time, they were slowly but surely pulled away from different parts of the network. The Great Eastern Railway, where they'd started off working on some of the expresses in East Anglia and Norfolk, was one of the first to receive new diesel locomotives in the form of Class 31 and Class 40 diesels, seeing the Britannias replaced from that region and removed from the expresses. The days on the Western region that we saw here were number 2, with the introduction of the Western hydraulic locomotives, such as the warships and the Westerns. And the fleet was then concentrated on Scotland and the north of England heading into the 1960s. As with a lot of steam at this time, the locomotives really did start to not be as well kept, shall we say, with repaints and overhauls, concentrating then on bringing them back into traffic, maybe not in quite the same physical standards as we can see here. This loco's had a very economy repaint with no lining at all, but it is still performing out there, and I believe this is at Manchester Victoria, so the locos were still out there into the 1960s. All the locomotives out there were still in operation right through until 1965, so these locomotives really did have a short lifespan, but they still managed to get to within 3 years of the end of British Rail Steam, with the first locomotive being withdrawn in 1965. The others really did disappear quite quickly after this, with more and more express duties and heavy freight duties transferring over to diesel haulage. The locomotives became a bit less loved. As you can see here, this particular loco having its nameplates removed from the front there. And whilst they did still perform, they were mainly working on heavy freight duties, as we can see here with this locomotive heading up the West Coast Main Line in 1967. So 1967 saw all but one of the locomotives withdrawn. There was no purpose for them anymore, but one was retained. It was 70013 Oliver Cromwell, of course, which is one of the famous locomotives preserved today. This was designated to be a rail tour locomotive, so a huge amount of rail tours running throughout 1968, celebrating well, celebrating is probably the wrong word really, but honouring the end of mainline steam on British railways. So this locomotive remained. It was cleaned up and prepared by a lot of enthusiasts and some friendly shed staff at the time. And of course, it is one of the locomotives that performed on the final mainline steam service ran by British Railways on the 11th of August 1968, the 15 Guinea Special. So this locomotive did perform on that final train. This saw it be one of the most important locomotives of that year, and 70013 was designated to the National Collection under ownership of the National Railway Museum, although it did head to the Bressingham Steam Museum in Norfolk initially, rather appropriate for a Britannia, as they had works just a couple of miles away on the main line from London to Norwich for many, many years. The locomotive remained there until around the mid-1990s, when it was transferred away to be overhauled at the Great Central Railway, and then has made appearances on the main line and in preservation since. I believe, as at the time of recording, it's just commenced its second overhaul, so we should see that back out on the network after a few years being fixed up. But that's not the only Britannia to be preserved. And of course, we have the original member of the Class 2, which is still with us. This is 70,000 Britannia. It's been owned by a couple of different people throughout its lives. It's been a pretty regular runner since around the 1970s, and it is still operational on the main line today. It's currently owned by Locomotive Services Limited, based at Crewe, privately owned by Jeremy Hoskin, I believe, and it is one of his steam locomotives under his collection, with other items such as Royal Scot, Bittern, and Blue Peter in that collection there too. So it's really fortunate that whilst only 2 of these locomotives have survived, we're still able to see them both out there on the network and in preservation, performing exactly as they should be. So let's have a look at the models. Let's shrink things down from the real size locomotives, and starting right back in the late 1950s, early 1960s, Hornby got very quickly onto producing a model of these particular locos. A lot of you, no doubt, the older generation, shall we say, who's watching today will have had one of these on their layouts. And these were available in a number of different liveries and guises, but mainly that seen here, representing 70,000, the original member of the class. That tooling was replaced in around the late 1970s, early 1980s, with a brand new tender drive model that we see here, which for its time had an incredible amount of detail. This was available until the early 2000s in pretty much every livery that the class carried. Although they did mainly carry the green, one or two of the locomotives did initially carry the BR black colour scheme, although this was only temporary while the locomotives were being put into traffic. So you could pick up one of these locomotives in one of these identities with many of the different styles of tender, the BR standardised tenders that they were fitted with throughout their lives. But as the 21st century rolled around, a brand new model was needed to really get to the super detail that we expect today. And this model has actually been released within the last week. So this really is hot off the press. This is the latest variation that we have available right now, showing the famous Oliver Cromwell that we've mentioned previously, as it would have been delivered into traffic in the early 1950s with the early emblem there. This model's fully digital ready. You've got a digital socket in the tender. You've got space for a sound decoder in the tender. 5-pole motor, all-wheel drive on there too, and all-wheel pickup. So it really is a superly detailed model that does the Britannia locomotives justice. And it's not just Oliver Cromwell that we have available now. It's been a pretty regular staple in Hornby's catalogue since the mid-2000s, and around 20 different running numbers and variations have been created on that new super detailed model. So if there's a certain loco you want to choose for your collection, take a look at that link in the description. We've either got them available new right now, or we have them as part of our pre-owned collection. N-gauge modelers, half the size, you can still get a fantastic Britannia model out there. And this has been made available by Dapol, who again have covered many different running numbers and minor livery variations of the class. At the moment, there's no model available new, although it may be something that Dapol bring out a new batch of in future years. But we do always have them available pretty much on our pre-owned section and our pre-owned listings on our website. So again, take a quick look there if you'd like to pick up a model in N-gauge. If you're a fan of the Britannias and you've not got a model railway already, or you're just looking for something for the mantelpiece, you can pick up a 1:120th scale model. This is a static model, so the wheels don't turn around, but it's still got a huge amount of detail on there too. These start at around £25. You can pick up a couple of different variations, and with it being corgi, there's quite a bit of die cast and plastic detailing in there too. So whilst they don't run on a model railway straight out of the box, it's a fantastic piece to put on your mantelpiece or maybe your desk if you are a fan of these particular locomotives. And it's really hard not to be a fan of the Britannia, really. It certainly is a 1950s design. We've done away with quite a lot of the streamlining and other necessary features from the 1930s. But what we have instead is a really powerful post-war locomotive that's easy to maintain, easy to amend to. And although they did have some initial teething problems, they really did start to find their own niche in the 1950s. And their life was unfortunately cut short by the 1955 modification plan of British Railways. So who knows, maybe if that hadn't happened, we could have seen hundreds of Britannias rather than the 55 built, and we could have seen them running into the 1970s and the 1980s. Certainly food for thought and something to think about as a what-if possibility, but the history of the locomotives as it happened is still really exciting, and it's rewarded by the great models that we have available in N-gauge, double O-gauge, and a static model in 1:120th scale too. So if you want to find out more, check the link in the description. We've got information on every single Britannia locomotive in model form that we have available right now down there. If I've not answered any questions that you wanted to know, or you want to find out a little bit more, please put a comment on the video or get in touch with our customer experience team, who'd be more than happy to answer any questions you have, whether it's about the models or the real life locomotives. Otherwise, I hope you've enjoyed today's session. I hope you've learned a little bit more about the Britannia locomotives and enjoyed doing so too. If you have enjoyed today's video, don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel and our Facebook page for more model railway skills casts, real railway profiles, and of course, all the latest model railway news too. Otherwise, thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.